the only show that brings music from all around the world, and we talk about human rights issues. And later on, we're gonna have some famous figures here, so you should definitely check it out.
Okay.
So we just listened to from Guatemala called The Disappeared Art. And now we're gonna have our guest.
One of the biggest problems of violence in Guatemala against women is femicide, which is the killing of women because they are women. There's also feminicide, which is the institutionalization of femicide, where the government is held responsible because it is not able to ensure the protection of women. On campus, a good way to become involved is by going on an alternative break and learning and interacting with the women in Guatemala trying to better the situation. Or here in DC, you can reach out to local community organizations like the Guatemala Human Rights Commission.
Welcome back, guys. You should check out our website and look at the images that some of the listeners, and you can actually take part in it, sent of human rights abuses all around the world.
Whether it's because of capitalism or whether it's because of some sort of, imposition of any sort. But, one very famous result has been the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires. And those are the mothers of the individuals that were kidnapped and disappeared. I mean, these disappearances have been very lightly touched on, and whenever they're touched on, they are presented as something that the Argentine government or the Chilean government did on their own, independently. And the question of why they were, these people were being disappeared is not really investigated into in some of the major news networks. It's something that should be looked into because some of the same methods that were allegedly being used in the tortures in the Southern Cone are the same alleged torture methods that are being used today in places like Bagram in Iraq and in Afghanistan and Guantanamo. I mean, it's something that I think is underreported. One great thing about the United States is that there's a great number of ways that people can get involved. But if you want to focus on specific regions like Latin America, I know, for example, organizations like Habitat for Humanity, they do a lot of great work in places like Central America. Well, I would probably want to check out the region myself, maybe study abroad there. That would be one good way to get a sense of what's going on down there and seeing.
Women workers who've been exposed to a number of human rights violations. Some of the most egregious human rights violations I think we've all probably heard about are things. And then also violations that are typical, I think, within factories in the developing world, things like limitations on their rights to associate freely, to try to create unions, to bargain collectively with their employers. Trafficking is also a big issue. Of labor trafficking, where women who live in one part of the country will move to another part in order to take on a job, and then there may be restrictions upon their movement. Or you also have trafficking across borders, where you have women coming from, for example, the Philippines or China to Saipan, which is a U.S. protectorate, and working there, also not seeing their family for long periods of time and having their passports seized and really being forced to stay at that one workplace, irrespective of what type of conditions they might face. You can think of more immediate causes. For example, the way that big apparel brands source their goods. So they really don't own the factories where their clothing is being produced. Rather, they source out, they contract out this actual sewing of their apparel. So it allows them to create a distance between themselves, their kind of nice brand image they may have here in the north, and kind of the dirty side of production down in the global south. And so a lot of activists are really focused on trying to recreate that link, saying that what you see advertised, on TV or in magazines isn't really reflective of the way that these clothing is, this clothing being produced. So in that sense, it puts pressure on the factory owners, who in turn put pressure on the workers. They're saying work faster, work harder, more hours, fewer mistakes. But what we need to address at a deeper level, I think, is, for example, consumer culture. The fact that we expect to have cheap clothes and new clothes every season at a low cost. So in some sense, that's the driver. That's what the apparel companies are trying to meet, is that shifting demand. In a really bigger sense, it's kind of the way that the global economy is structured, right? It's this kind of predominance of this neoliberal paradigm that developing countries, want to become developed, and that's one where they open their markets to free trade, and the kind of idea that free trade, foreign direct investment is kind of a panacea, right? It's going to solve all the problems. There can be, development and growth, and everyone's going to be better off. But in fact, what we find is that the competition is so brutal where you're really pitting, in one sense, one developing country against another, that there's really instead a race to the bottom and not a race to the top. One of the biggest common misconceptions is that it's kind of this notion that the workers are happy for their jobs. Well, I mean, yes, obviously these are, workers who live in poor areas. Kind of a cynical statement to make in some sense. They're desperate for a job. It's not a choice. It's the only choice that they have. I think another misperception is this idea of a kind of stage theory of development, kind of like, well, here in the West, in the United States, in Great Britain, we also had this point in time where we had a big apparel industry, and we had sweatshops, and it was predominantly women workers, and they suffered. But then with time, they fought for their rights, and it was actually just a stepping stone to economic development and growth. Industrialization, that's how it works. And I think that, and then to conclude from that that's what's happening in the developing world, they're going through those stages of industrial development the way we did, is also very cynical because you really can't compare the two situations. I'm hoping that we've realized now, and there are actually, global standards, core labor rights standards that need to be respected. We all recognize those standards as being key human rights standards. It's also a very different economy. When the United States or Britain industrialized, they were closed economies. There was, some trade, but not to a great extent. Nowadays, this is a global industry. The exploitation that's being suffered in the developing world is at the hands of, in some ways, consumers in the developed world who are, buying those cheap products and don't seem to be concerned too much about how they're made. So as a consumer, to kind of just go and ask, how is my clothing being made, to inform yourself, to make the link between yourself as a consumer in the North and these workers in the global South, to help better understand, how your actions here have repercussions really on a worldwide scale in a lot of sense. I think also there are alternatives. There's this whole trend towards socially conscientious consumerism, and there are a number of companies out there who try to be what they call sweat-free, right? To try to make sure that they're only sourcing clothing from factories where women's rights are respected, where workers are earning a decent wage. At East Campus, there's two student groups. One is an affiliate. There's an umbrella student organization called the United Students Against Sweatshop. USAS is the acronym. And American University has an affiliate on campus called AU Solidarity Committee. And they used to work in the past on sweatshop issues, trying to ensure that AU's clothing carrying AU's logo isn't made in sweatshops. And as a result, American University actually joined two organizations, something called the Workers' Rights Consortium, and another organization called the Fair Labor Association, both of which are meant to ensure that AU's apparel isn't made in sweatshops. And then there's another student group called the Fair Trade Student Association, and they really reflect that kind of socially conscientious consumerism. Kind of the idea that, be it the clothing we wear on our backs or the coffee we drink in our mugs to stay awake, to study long hours, that we want to make sure that all those goods that we're coming in contact with and using on a daily basis are really made in ways that aren't exploitative to workers around the world.
So, unfortunately, our radio show is coming to an end, but that doesn't mean your actions have to. This is not only about what I say, this is about the things that you decide to do.
Para a cara do sossego. Pois paz sem voz não é paz, é medo.